Live by satellite from our studios in Los Angeles, Brian Wilson, Dennis Wilson, Carl Wilson, Mike Love, Al Jardine, and Dennis, maybe you'd like to start this off. Why do you think that you've had such, continued popularity? We're keeping you awake?
I'm borrowing my brother Carl's microphone. Is this ABC?
Yeah.
You need a new microphone.
No. What do you listen to when you're at home?
I listen to a record called Be My Baby by the Ronettes.
This interview took place on December 5th, 1980. The Beach Boys had released their 24th studio album, Keeping the Summer Alive, 7 months previous. It failed to make any impact, but for a decade none of their albums have. Alcoholism, drug abuse and madness followed the band through the whole journey. This is the story of the Beach Boys' turbulent career. November 5th, 1982. Brian Wilson awakes to his usual morning routine of an extra strength instant coffee which he fills with 6 spoons of sugar. His hand shakes so violently he spills an equal amount on the kitchen worktop. His breakfast consists of 2, sometimes 3, extra thick New York steaks served with a bottle of steak sauce. After he's finished, Brian begins chain smoking cigarettes. By the end of the day, Brian's gone through 5 or 6 packs of Marlboro. A few years earlier, he had developed a habit of talking out the side of his mouth. At over 340 pounds, Brian waddles from room to room. The house he sits in shows the remnants of a week's worth of cocaine, booze and junk food. He'd long since given up washing, changing his clothes or brushing his teeth. He had once enthusiastically told his ex-wife Marilyn, "I want to know what it's like to be homeless." Brian looks outside to check the weather. It must be a sunny day, if not, Brian won't even attempt to venture out. On this day, Brian will receive news that will drastically change his life for the next decade. Brian is living with a nurse turned carer in a relationship in which Brian is free to drink, snort cocaine and answer to no one. His brother Dennis would often visit him. Together they would snort cocaine, then Dennis would lure him to the music room with a bag of McDonald's burgers. But little is ever achieved in the music sessions between the two brothers. At this point in his life, Dennis is wildly out of control. The Beach Boys would throw him out the band in order for him to sober up, in which he would. But Dennis never stayed sober long, and this cycle continued for the rest of his life. Mike Love, the lead singer of the Beach Boys, made his feelings clear about Dennis's drug and alcohol use. Mike, by 1982, had been through 7 marriages. His 7th marriage only lasted a year, and it was not long before he was married again. Mike had a penchant for turning up to concerts in bizarre clothing. Around this time he was wearing tennis clothes with a trucker's hat. One night at a concert, Love made a comment that enraged Dennis so much he lunged from his drum kit and a fist fight ensued. Dennis was then pulled off stage by security and locked in a closet. There he was left for the remainder of the gig, so there was no fear of him returning on stage.
It really scared me. I thought, oh my God, something someday is going to really happen to Dennis and he won't be here.
Dennis's drunken antics on stage became legendary, and from this point the two were kept separate. But it wasn't always like this. The two cousins were in harmony when the Beach Boys first got together. Dennis was the band's drummer on the insistence of his mother Audrey, but Dennis never learned to hold the drumsticks in the correct manner. When the band was struggling to find a niche, Dennis came up with the idea of surfing. Surfing at this time in California was all the craze. There were even surf reports broadcasted every morning on the radio. When their father Murray Wilson heard their music, he took a keen interest in managing their career.
Murray was like sitting in a public library when a freight train comes through.
Murray had been a struggling songwriter and saw the Beach Boys as a group he could live vicariously through. It wasn't long before he got them a contract at Capitol Records. Brian had begun a songwriting partnership with Gary Usher, a talented young musician who lived nearby. Envious of the duo, Murray insisted he be the one writing songs with Brian. Usher attended one of the songwriting sessions. "Let's write a song about yellow roses," Murray said to Usher's disbelief. "That's really old-fashioned," Usher replied. Not long after, Usher was thrown out of the house. He could still hear Murray screaming at Brian when he was walking down the street. Brian apologised profusely the next time he saw Usher. The music room of the house was where Brian spent most of his time, and it was also his bedroom. Murray would lie on his bed listening, and if he heard a note he didn't like, he would come barreling in to correct Brian. One time Brian lost it with Murray and told him to F off. Murray never got over that and would constantly bring it up. In 1962, Capitol Records released the Beach Boys' first single, 409, a car song written as a tribute to the Chevrolet 409, was a flop. Capitol quickly changed tactics and pushed surfing instead, which reached number 14 on the charts. After that, Capitol rushed the Beach Boys into a studio, and in a 12-hour session, Surfing Safari was complete. Around this time, Dennis, on the orders of Murray, was crafting a cigar box, which Murray planned to give to some business friends. When Dennis was finished, Murray told him it wasn't good enough, to which Dennis, in a fit of rage, punched Murray in the face. An all-out brawl ensued, and a neighbour had to come and break the fight up.
Murray had lost an eye in a machine accident. He wore a glass eye, and Dennis told me that when he did something that really rubbed Murray the wrong way, he would punish him by removing his glass eye and making Dennis stand nose to him and stare in the empty socket.
Brian went on to great success with his songs, but Murray was always critical of anything Brian wrote. One time, Murray tried to cancel the studio sessions for fun because he didn't like the song.
Murray would come in, and he really wanted to be the producer.
Another time, while recording Help Me Rhonda, Murray turned up to the studio drunk and began disrupting the session.
What are the words? Sing it.
Since you put me down, I've been out doing it in my head.
Right, sing it.
Since you put me down.
No. Since you put me down.
Things came to a head during the recording of I Get Around. Brian fired Murray, who was devastated. So much so, he took to his bed for 5 weeks. After recovering, Murray began managing a new band called the Sun Rays. Murray planned them to be a Beach Boys clone. Their first singles were of course written by Murray, and of course they flopped. But the next single, I Live for the Sun, was a small hit. Their next 5 singles then flopped. Brian during this time developed a fascination with marijuana and then later LSD. One of his albums he recorded live at Mike's house included 3 Beatles covers. When Brian released Pet Sounds, the group were uncertain of the experimental album. But worse yet, Brian's behaviour was becoming increasingly bizarre and unpredictable. Caroline No was released as a single and reached number 32. The next single, Sloop John B, fared better, reaching number 3. In England, the reviews for Pet Sounds were ecstatic, but in the US it was a flop. His next album, Smile, was abandoned, but the single Good Vibrations was an immediate critical and commercial success. Around this time, Murray released a solo album entitled The Many Moods of Murray Wilson. He stated, "After Good Vibrations, Brian lost a lot of confidence. He didn't think he could write anything as good as that again. With my LP, I'm going to nudge my boy's competitive spirit." The album is currently available on Spotify. In 1968, Dennis Wilson returns home from a recording session at 1440 Sunset Boulevard. As Dennis pulled up to his house, the lights were blaring and there seemed to be a party going on inside. A small man exits the house, barely more than 5 feet tall. He approached Dennis, fell to his knees and kissed his sneakers. "Who are you?" Dennis said. "I'm a friend," he replied, and invited Dennis into his own house. The house was occupied by 12 or so girls drinking alcohol, smoking marijuana, and helping themselves to whatever food was available. 2 of the girls Dennis had picked up earlier had been part of the Manson family. An opportunity for a struggling songwriter like Manson to befriend a beach boy was not one he was going to pass up. Manson preyed on lost outsiders with a troubled upbringing. Despite his fame, Dennis fit this description perfectly. Manson regularly handed out LSD to his group of followers who he called his family. He insisted they all take the drug, but he gave himself a much smaller dosage, if any at all. This would secure his authority amongst the family. At the time Manson met Dennis Wilson, he was 33 and he'd spent half his life in prison. Before they met Dennis, the family had lived on a disused movie ranch in Chatsworth. It was owned by George Spawn, who named it Spawn Ranch. But soon Dennis would invite the family to move into his home to live. Charlie, as he was known, helped himself to anything that belonged to Dennis. Clothes, food, cars, even a few gold records which he gave away as gifts. Despite access to food delivered each day, the family still made trips to garbage cans for food. Dennis would occasionally accompany them in his Ferrari. When interviewed in 1968 for an English magazine called Rave, Dennis mentioned Charlie Manson. "Fear is nothing but awareness. Sometimes the wizard frightens me. Charlie Manson, who's a friend of mine, says he's God and the devil. He sings, plays and writes poetry." Not long after, Dennis tried to further Manson's musical career, though later Dennis said he had not a musical bone in his body. Dennis brought him to recording studios, but no one was impressed by him. He smelled so bad they nicknamed him Pigpen, but not to his face. Things went downhill over the coming months and Dennis grew tired of the family.
One of the accountants for Dennis says you have a $1,200 Altadena dairy bill. They were charging everything. The Altadena dairy man would be unloading his truck there, though that started to play on Dennis. He didn't want people to take advantage of him, and that became more and more apparent that that's what was going on.
One time Manson held a knife to Dennis's throat saying, "What would you do if I just killed you?" "Do it," was the response, to which Manson lowered the knife. Dennis never told the family to leave his home. He was renting the house and 3 weeks before his lease expired he simply didn't renew. He left the house and rented elsewhere, and when the rent wasn't paid, the family were thrown out. Manson wasn't upset by Dennis's actions. He simply moved back to Spawn Ranch. Dennis was not a contact he wanted to lose. He would later turn up at Dennis's apartment if he was ever low on food. On the Beach Boys' next album, Dennis included a song Manson wrote called "Cease to Exist." He changed the lyric to "Cease to Resist" and the title to "Never Learn Not to Love." This infuriated Manson, even though this was the only time a Manson song would feature in the charts. Terry Melcher, a record producer who'd worked with the Byrds, went to Spawn Ranch twice to listen to Manson's music. The first time he left pleased but not blown away with what he heard. The second time a scene broke out in which Manson beat up a drunk ranch hand. This incident completely destroyed Manson's chances of a record deal. After this rejection, all hell would break loose in Manson's world. He would seek revenge, in which would result in a spree of murders and a lifetime imprisonment. In 1970, Murray assembled a tape of songs he gave to the Beach Boys. At the beginning of the tape, he suggested they record these because he didn't have long left to live. In the years following, Murray's health began to deteriorate. Murray had begun to regularly socialise with Dennis. The two would drink and watch football games together. On Mother's Day in 1973, Murray told Dennis during a phone conversation, "I'm just going to live about a month." 4 months later, Murray died of a heart attack. Brian and Dennis did not attend the funeral, but Dennis visited Murray's body in the morgue. Members of the Sunrays described Murray as the nicest man ever. By 1982, Dennis's alcohol problems had become so serious he drank from morning to night. When he woke up in the morning, he would go to his local liquor store and buy a bottle of vodka and a jug of orange juice. He would pour half the orange juice out and top it up with vodka, which he would drink throughout the day. If Dennis wasn't topped up with alcohol, his hands would shake violently. One time Dennis was out food shopping, and when he came to pay, his hands were shaking so much that he couldn't sign his name. Dennis went out into the parking lot, drank 2 cans of beer and then returned. He was bloated, haggard looking, and didn't resemble the lean surfer he once was. He spoke in a roaring, rasping voice.
Folks, if you knew what it felt like to be up here singing, God bless you, the Beach Boys,
and frequented his favourite bar, Shay Shay's, each day. He was broke and never had a stable residence. An ultimatum was thrown down that if he entered rehab for 30 days, the Beach Boys would buy back his boat, the Harmony. Dennis had refurbished the grand yacht, but money problems meant he couldn't keep it. He entered rehab in another attempt to detox, but left after only 2 days. On December 28, 1983, Dennis sat with friends at Marina del Rey. He ate turkey sandwiches and his friends attempted to slow down his drinking. After that, he began diving into the water where the Harmony was once docked. He swam to the bottom of the ocean bed searching for items that he'd thrown over previously. He surfaced before diving back down and never surfaced again. In a panic, his friends called Harbour Patrol and they dived into the water to search for Dennis. He was found 45 minutes later. November 5th, 1982. Brian receives a letter from the Beach Boys notifying him he was fired and that his spending has drained his bank accounts. The whole thing was a ruse in order to persuade Brian into accepting help, and the help would come from Dr. Eugene Landy. So desperate was Brian's situation, extreme measures had to be taken. Many believed if not, Brian would soon be dead. Brian had no choice but to accept help from Landy, and this would mean 24-hour therapy. The two met for a consultation in which Landy told him his liver's bad, you have 1/4 of your lung capacity, your heart is oversized, and you're 150 pounds overweight. A month later, Brian was checked into Cedars-Sinai Hospital. There he refused to bathe, threw food, yelled at the nurses, and spent most of his time chain smoking. Upon discharge, Dr. Landy took Brian to an isolated compound in Hawaii. The morning after, Landy with a medical team drove Brian to the beach. At that point, Landy stated, "This is as far as we're driving, and now we're going to walk back." Brian in a panic protested, "But I can't walk back." "Then you can stay in the car," Landy replied, walking up the road. After a temper tantrum, Brian gave in and began walking. "I'm going to die if I don't stop," Brian said, gasping for air. "You're not going to die, I promise you that. You're only going to feel like you're dying," Landy replied. An hour later, Brian was climbing the last couple of steps to the house he was staying, albeit winded, soaked in sweat, and extremely angry. On entering the house, Brian fell into a chair in the living room. "Breakfast!" he bellowed. "It's coming," Landy replied, who was now seated next to him. One of Landy's team entered and placed down a glass of blended juice. Brian downed this in one gulp. "Where's the rest?" he asked. "That's it, there is no more," Landy replied. "For the next week it's just juice and multivitamins." Unbeknownst to Brian, Landy had started him on a juice-only fast. Brian remained on a juice diet for the first week, but after that his breakfast was upgraded to frozen fruit. So frightened of showering, the first week Brian swam in Landy's pool each day in order to clean himself. Then he upgraded to washing himself in the ocean, and by the end of the week Landy pushed Brian to stand in the shower. Brian feared what would come out of the shower head: snakes, blood, acid. So Landy undressed, stood under the shower and showed Brian it was safe. In the daytimes, Landy forbid Brian to stay in his bedroom. "The bedroom's for sleeping," he said. Instead, Brian spread out on the couch, lay on the floor, or sat in a dark closet. Deirdre Courtney was hired to cook Brian's meals and the fridges were padlocked. The chef later said of Dr. Landy, "He would humiliate you in a very quiet, controlled way. He would never shout and scream." The film got that wrong, referring to the later film Love and Mercy. She later got a thank you credit on Brian's first solo album. Brian was also given medication for schizophrenia. Doctors later said this was a misdiagnosis by Landy and stopped the medication. Brian's health improved greatly. The grueling regime continued for months, then years. By 1985, it was clear that Eugene Landy had saved Brian's life. Each morning, Brian ran 6 miles, lifted weights, then sat down to a healthy breakfast, washed down with herbal tea. There was a strange contrast to Brian's rehabilitation. On one hand, healthy foods, exercise and sociability. On the other hand, no free will, 24-hour supervision and medication that fried Brian's mind. By 1989, Dr. Landy had lost his license to practice psychology. Of the 7 charges brought against him, Landy admitted to unlawfully prescribing drugs and surrendered his license. Brian and Landy continued to work musically. Their therapeutic relationship had ended, but Landy still had a close hold on Brian's life. They parted after legal action was brought by Brian's family in 1991. Landy moved to Hawaii and died in 2006 from lung cancer. Brian Wilson continues to write and perform songs to this day.